Our second panel, National Narrative. Indivisible with liberty and justice for all. When you think about the phrase with liberty and justice for all, with a period, it was a very bold statement, or a very somewhat ironic statement when it was written into the American infamy. But what the founders did was set a specific precedence for those who would follow in their footsteps. It was a challenge for the following generations to devise the concept they envisioned. It has taken a long time for liberty and justice to be evenly experienced by all, and we still have work to do. But where do the rights of one person end and the other one begin? This day and age, the more people we bring to the table, individuals' liberty and justice can appear to overlap, and what we think those rights are coming into conflict. There's a very fine line, and our panel here today is going to discuss how precious that line is and what does the future hold if we aren't careful and remain indivisible with liberty and justice for all. I am proud to introduce our second panel of the afternoon. Our moderator, the founder of Civility Dinners and co-host of Unsafe Space, Keri Smith. Our speakers for the panel, former Navy officer, host of Human Events Daily, Jack Posobiec.
Yes, exactly. These are OGs. These aren't vipers. These are OGs.
Please.
These aren't vipers. My brother found them in my parents' closet. We've had them since the 90s.
Welcome back to the stage, Stephen Bonnell. And my man who just hit 150,000 subscribers, the Sean Fitzgerald. And host of the news and why it matters from Blaze TV, Sara Gonzales.
Sara, I feel like your shoes need their own introduction.
I was hoping that NASA could see them from space when I was walking here. That was my goal.
I think you're giving Nico a run for his money.
You know, someone's got to do it, so.
Well, thank you guys for being with us here today. I wanted to start off by saying something that I think is probably obvious to anyone who's at this conference. America is in the midst of an identity crisis. Vanity Fair recently described the controversy surrounding the 1619 Project, for example, as, quote, a fight over who will tell the story of this country and how we think of its identity. It seems as if we are to find any common ground, we might first start by seeing if we can even agree on what is our national story, what does it mean to be an American, what are our country's founding principles, and should they be seen as a source of unity or a source of division? Jack, if you'd like to start.
Wow, okay. You know, it's weird kind of thinking about this sort of like national identity stuff and national narrative, because it feels like every day when, you know, you're sort of in the front lines of, you know, news or breaking news or, you know, cases like Sean covers, you know, so many criminal cases that are going on, that because we've sort of merged the essence really of what our national ideas are, what our conceptions are, what we think of as important, versus just this sort of like dissembling of identity, right, in America. And I think that's the real crisis, is that we've lost the national identity, and somewhere along the line, through, you know, a lot of deconstructivist thinking, and really also through commercialization and, you know, hyper-commercialization, hyper-individualism, where you now have people that instead of identifying as maybe, you know, in the past they might have said, well, you know, I'm an American, but I'm also, you know, we were just talking backstage, a Bostonian, you know, or a New Yorker, or, you know, I'm originally from the Philly area, so like you're an Eagles fan, right? You know, and it just is what it is. And of course I'm saying that in Dallas, and my dad said
that's
that
brave.
My dad, of course, said he would give me $20 if I said that while I was in Dallas, so Dad, you owe me. But, right, we had these sort of identities, or, you know, maybe a religious identity, you know, you're Catholic and all this, but it somewhere along the line, we started adding identities, and we added more and more and more and more. And now it seems like those new identities, what shows do you watch? Are you a Marvel fan? Are you a Disney fan? Are you this? Are you that? What political team are you on? Well, I'm this, I'm that. And so you then start to identify as this label that you put yourself on. And it used to be that some of those identities were at least rooted under the sort of like umbrella identity of being an American, being an American citizen, what that meant. But it somewhere along the line, probably since the 90s, I feel like it's actually changed, and we're taking the newer identities and sort of forgetting about the older stuff.
Yeah, to double up on what he's saying, the phenomenon that you're referring to is actually called Neo-Medievalism. And it was like first written about in a book, or I first heard about it in a book called The Modern Mercenary. And it was talking about the impact of this on the battlefield, because we're relying more and more on contractors. And if you guys know your medieval history, like you would, as a member of society, you would swear allegiance to a lord, a king, and you would also have a faith. And it's like, what happens when your lord is in conflict with your king or in conflict with your faith? This would produce problems and contradictions that can rip societies apart. And we're seeing that not only overseas with our contractors, where we have people who are loyal to companies, their own nation state, their own faith, but we're also seeing that in the United States. Like all this like over-identifying and identifying with things that are in conflict with one another is bound to create these negative consequences. Because again, if you're identifying as something that is in conflict with like an American vision or in conflict with somebody else, or you have multiple contradicting identities, what happens when those conflicts are brought to the forefront? And I think that's what we're seeing in our society right now.
If I could, I would also just like to add too, I think just as people, as humans, we are tribalistic, right? Like if we look at our ancestors, we were all tribal. And so we have to have this common purpose, this common sense of identity, this common goal. And I think I would agree that we've completely lost sight of what that goal is. And I just think even if you look at in society, even if you look at a smaller subset of people, you look at a family. What happens to a family, a husband and a wife and children who disagree on what their common principles are, who disagree on what their common goals are? Does that family stay together? Absolutely not. And so I think that when you're looking at, how America has really shifted, and we've got these new ideas now, which isn't a surprise because of the indoctrination that's happening in all of these institutions that are teaching our children, teaching these people who are exiting college. When you're looking at that, it's no surprise that we've lost our sense of identity, but certainly if you are on the train that America needs to come back together, which I recognize there are two thought processes here, and one of them is we just need a national divorce because we're too far gone, and one of them is we need to come back together, and this is how we're going to have to do it. But I would say if you are on the team of coming back together in America, there is absolutely no way we can do it with no sense of common purpose.
I would say that all of us suffer from a really bad bout of recentism. I think it's easy to feel that we have, right now in this moment in history, an incredibly unique fracture in what we would consider an American identity. But I would say that, there have been far worse periods of history in the United States. We literally went to war with ourselves over a fractured identity. But even more importantly, I'd say even in the founding principles of this country, with the Federalist Papers trying to bring together the 13th colonies, we've always kind of had this idea of, yeah, we're Americans, but we're not all just Americans. You've got people that live in different areas. You've got a divide between religious people of different factions. You've got divides between city dwellers and urban dwellers. You've got Midwesterners. You've got NFL fans. There's all these different ways that we've historically always kind of divided us. We've had slaves. We've had not slaves. We've had, Irish and Italian immigrants. We've had so many different groups of come into the United States and ultimately, hopefully, merge together. Now, I think we kind of disagree on what it means to merge. We use the phrase melting pot. We have a lot of different groups here. In some ways, we seem to be at strife with one another. But I think that part of the strength of the United States is we've always been, to some extent, pretty fractured. And I think that it's easy to feel, because of all of the unique problems we have lately, especially with social media, that we're in some unique point in history where our identity is fractured. And aside from the Civil War, aside from internment camps in World War II, aside from crazy college kids that were indoctrinated in the 60s protesting against things like the Vietnam War and civil rights, I think that we've always had a healthy amount of conflict in the U.S. identity. identity. I think that we can do things to bring it together, but I think it's important to recognize that it's not unique that we feel fractured today.
Do you think, though, that it's the level of contempt that we have for one another, for people who disagree with us, is unique, that we're at a pretty high point of contempt? Because it's one thing to say, like, we're fractured, we have different cultures or different opinions and different beliefs, but I think it's another thing to say we also view people with different opinions as morally in the wrong, and we have contempt for them. Is that something that's new, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that we've had, historically, there have been huge conflicts between different groups of people in the United States, where we've seen, Irish and Italian immigrants were like enemies of the U.S. or couldn't find employment in places. Union versus non-union workers, especially post-civil rights era, was a huge divide in terms of how, should unions be regulating themselves or should the federal government do it, a la the Civil Rights Act. I think we've always had like some level of contempt for each other. I think that what's unique today in U.S. history is the amplification exists in a way that it never did before, which I could maybe say to some extent makes it a little unique. Because, a long time ago, if I hated Joe Schmo in my neighborhood, I hated Joe Schmo in my neighborhood. Maybe everybody in my neighborhood knew. If it was really bad, maybe my church knew. If it was really bad, maybe everybody in the union knew. But nowadays, the entire world can know in a heartbeat if I don't like a particular guy, and uniquely, the entire world can come down on that guy. Cancel culture didn't exist when news only spread as far as your newspaper traveled.
But I would also argue that that's why it is more fractured than in previous times, because as you said, the amplification of one voice can affect so many different people that they didn't even realize that they could affect.
I'm actually not going to disagree with him on that. We literally had a mini civil war over the state of Kansas. I think that we've had worse times, and a lot of this national divorce talk is doom and gloom. And I called it subversive nonsense on Twitter, and people got mad at me for it. But we've had divisions that are deep in this country that have led to conflict in this country. I think the thing that's different now is the way that we view the federal government. Right now, we believe that when you elect the president, it's that person's job to impose their will on the rest of the country. Before, we had more checks and balances, so you could have states that were kind of going in their own direction because you had specific roles for the federal government and specific roles for the states. So I don't think it's as bad as it's ever been. I think that is a little bit of catastrophizing for sure, but I think the way we view national politics is worse.
I think also to piggyback on the back of that real quick too, I think that a lot of it becomes a numbers game with the amplification as well. Mm-hmm. Let's say, for instance, I could show you every single day a new story of a horrific black on white hate crime or white on black hate crime. If I could show you one story every single day, would that even necessarily be a bad thing? In a nation of 330 million people, you're never going to have zero problems. You're never going to have zero crime. There's something called the Chinese bank robber fallacy, where I could theoretically show you 1,000 new Chinese bank robberies happening every single day, assuming that we're looking at all the Chinese people across the world, and it still wouldn't necessarily make it a trend or a bad thing. It's just when you have so many numbers of people, you're bound to be able to pick and choose the types of stories you want to tell, which can lead people into thinking that things are so much worse than they actually are.
So the biggest division today isn't necessarily even political in the sense of conservative, liberal, or Republican, Democrat. The biggest thing is that we're living now in the United States through an era of regime politics. And there has been, really since probably 2015, 2014, a level of populist sentiment on both the right and the left that has, and I think rightly, targeted this regime of, and it's tied to the federal government, it's tied to the president, it's also tied to Congress, it's tied to many, many institutions throughout the government, or that work in hand with the government. The rise of essentially this administrative state that, and it was goes back to Wilsonian doctrine. This idea that universities and the academy would essentially borrow some of the sovereignty from our government and then be used to control, the decisions of the government itself, even though they're, of course, not elected officials. This was part of the German idea that the regime should exist separate from elected government, and that so that science and enlightenment and reason should be separated from the muddy, grubby world of politics. And so that regime has become more and more powerful. It has also been amplified by many of these factors, but because so many people have decided that it is not serving the people well, they're turning to candidates then, and again, this is both on the right and the left, that are actually in opposition to that regime. If you look at what happened in 2016 and then after that, you can see that the regime feels very threatened. This is one of the reasons that even though we had the social media amplification system, which arguably is still in place, they're doing everything they can to put these shackles and hammer down on anybody that really speaks out across these narratives when it comes to this, because the regime has the line of the regime, the inner party sets the truth, and that anything that stands in opposition to this must be rooted out. And any people, if they become rooted out because of this, must also be taken down. This, of course, leads to the arrest of Julian Assange. It leads to the current investigation on James O'Keefe. It leads to the demonization of Tulsi Gabbard when she ran for president. Many of these other voices out there, and the entire anti-war movement, by the way, any of these voices, Chelsea Manning, great example, any of these voices, right, that come out that say, I don't like what the regime is doing, are then destroyed, and they must thusly be destroyed because we're living through that era. So I don't necessarily think that it's all left-right. I mean, there certainly is a lot of that, but there's also a lot of this sort of up-down division that we're seeing as well.
So I want to get back to this question just quickly about the level of contempt that we feel for one another as a result of all this. I was reading a recent Brown and Stanford University study that reported that effective polarization, meaning the amount of negativity that a citizen feels towards political parties other than their own, has increased dramatically in the United States in the past 40 years. And I agree with you. I don't think that it's necessarily organically a political kind of division. I think that's being manufactured. But in the past 40 years, people are now reporting more contempt, more negativity towards people in the other party. So if you look at people in 1960, for example, 4% of Democrats and 4% of Republicans said they would be unhappy if their child chose to marry someone of the opposite political party. By 2019, that figure was 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans said they would be unhappy if their child married outside of their political party. What are the factors specifically, if there are any factors like social media that are making this a uniquely contemptuous time for people with disagreements, what are those factors? Well, could we agree on what some of those are?
Well, I would say that we've known for a long time, I mean, if you guys read The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt's book, that it's Haidt, but I like to call him Haidt, because that's how it's spelled. If you read his book, that the left has hated the right for a long time in this nation. And one of the unique things, and they've done this through surveys where the left literally can't understand, the further left you are, the worse you are at guessing the values of right-wing people. But one of the things that's happened that's become interesting is now we have the right hating them back. It used to be a situation where the left thought you were evil if you were on the right wing, and people on the right just thought you were wrong or stupid, and they would try to convince you. But now we're seeing this almost, it's taken decades. We're seeing the right push back, and I don't know if that's due to social media. I don't know if it's due to the fact that, for decades these people are telling you that that they hate you, and you can only go for so long saying, oh, they're just ignorant, and now people are like, all right, I hate you back. But I think the right's polarization, or their more vitriol for the left, that 35% number is, it's still lower, but I think that's relatively new.
I think as well, a lot of this, to kind of use my theory of the regime on this is fomented, right? This is fomented on both sides to keep them pitted against each other, to really sort of occlude what is actually happening in this country right now. So you'll see, many times we've seen federal agencies or agents of national security teams go in and then implant informants in things like Black Lives Matter or other left-wing groups. You're starting to see it now in this Boogaloo movement, which it seems like it was almost completely created by the federal government, as well as people that are more associated with these militia groups, these Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, and various other groups that are associated with things that happened throughout 2020 and early 2021. And so this type of anger and polarization is fostered by the regime because they are seeking to push what's essentially known as a color revolution. Now, color revolution is something that, had you been in Eastern Europe, or if you had been following the events of the Arab Spring, you would see how different regimes or pockets of regimes or groupings of regimes are using these tactics to be able to achieve geopolitical primacy. You're seeing that. We saw it in Ukraine. You saw it across the Arab Spring. You've seen it. Really, pick a country in Eastern Europe. It's happened there probably a few times. The only difference is these types of forces aren't really used in the West. And so through those instances, any one of these polarizations, and then specifically acts of violence, has to be filtered through the lens of the regime narrative. So whether it's the events of January 6th, whether it's the events of Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, George Floyd, whatever it is, it's filtered through that narrative so that the regime can achieve its ends.
I feel like the regime has always done, if we look at it from the regime lens, I feel like that's an unsatisfactory explanation because the government has always done weird stuff. Whether we're talking Tuskegee with the experiments on black people and syphilis, whether we're talking the FBI informants that were embedded into people like the Black Panthers in the Civil Rights era, I think the government's always been up to kind of funny business, whether we're talking about MK Ultra, there's all sorts of different projects that the government has done, arguably some that have been worse in the past than what exists today. I feel like for a slightly less conspiratorial view, rather than regime versus the people, I think that something that happens, it's kind of in line, I guess obviously I favor my paradigm, with the amplification of stuff is something that's happened is we have become hyper-nationalized in our political landscape, and we're kind of sold this illusion that there is a unifying Democratic Party and a unifying Republican Party, and that is absolutely not true. A Democrat that exists in West Virginia has absolutely nothing in common with a Democrat generally that exists in like California. And we have this issue where and it doesn't surprise me that people might view each other as worse, but that's because if I were to ask a Republican in any of the Bible Belt, what do you think of when I say like Democrat? You're not actually thinking of another Democrat that might exist in your city or on your state legislature or your city council or whatever. You're thinking of AOC. You're thinking of the Justice Dems. You're thinking of President Biden. You're thinking of Obama. And then much the same if I ask a Democrat, like, oh, well, who are you thinking about? And they're thinking like, Jim Jordan, or they're thinking Donald Trump, or they're thinking of, all of these national level Republicans. I think that when we kind of lose, I think that when we look at our unique political landscapes that exist on a local level, you're going to find a lot of overlap in values. If you go to a particular city election, it's pretty rare that you're going to have an ultra left-leaning socialist running against like a far-right Trump supporter. Usually there's going to be a lot of shared values in between the two of these people, because that's typically how local politics works. But I think when we become so nationalized in all of these conversations, we kind of forget, like, not to call anybody out, but like, who is on your state legislature, or who is your mayor, or who is your governor sometimes? People don't even know, But we sure can name the last thing that AOC tweeted, or the last fight that Ben Shapiro got in with some congressperson, because the national level politics is all we see. And when that is what you see, I think because we see the most extreme of that, you tend to think that the people of the opposite political party living near you embody the values of the most extreme figures you see from halfway across the country on Twitter or television.
I kind of want to add to something, Sean, that you said, which was, I know you said, finally the right has said, I hate you back. And I do maybe it's semantics to some people, but to me, I would just like to, in my opinion, tweak that a little bit, which is, I think that you can only poke the bear for so long until the bear finally says, I'm done, right? So what I have seen, it has not been so much that you hate us and we hate you back, but it's just we have been disrespected for so long. We have been told that we are white supremacists, that we are this, that we are that we are transphobic, that we are homophobic, all of the phobics for so long that you can only live like that for so long before you turn back and say, you know what, I'm kind of done. I just don't really care to live like this anymore. And I do think that it is an important distinction, because in my experience, I haven't seen that hatred coming from the right, but more so just, okay, I'm kind of tired of this. I'm done with the energy. I just don't want to play the game anymore.
Oh, for sure. And I do think a big driving factor is the emphasis on racial politics. Mm-hmm. Obviously, race is very divisive, and no matter what most people say about how they don't mind being called racist at this point, it's something that bothers you because that's one of the worst things to call somebody. It's close. The closest thing to it is calling somebody a pedophile. Like, that's how serious the allegation is. So ever since we've the left has really, and you could track their mentions of white supremacy on Google Trends. Ever since they've like ratcheted up that rhetoric, we've seen the response from the Republicans because they were always nasty. They always like hated George W. Bush. They would call him an idiot. They hated Sarah Palin and all that. But we're like, whatever, that's politics. Like, you know, we understand. We don't like Hillary Clinton because she kills people. Like, we get it. Like, but once everybody became like deplorable white supremacists and all that, and you just see this everywhere, and it's not the full left. Like, you know, progressives make up like 7% of the population, and like these are the people most likely to be ratcheting it up, but people just fall in line and they comply with that loud 7%. And I think that's led to the right seeing the left as that and realizing that even if I know intellectually you don't hate me on the left, you're willing to stand idle while my name gets dragged through the mud or my family's members' names gets dragged through the mud because you're not willing to call it out because we've like glorified the allegations of racism in this country. So I do think that has led to, you know, that is the poking of the bear, and that's where we went too far, or they went too far.
We would also probably be remiss, or I would probably be remiss if we didn't bring up the one area of polarization that's even larger than political right now. And that has to do with the way that society is becoming polarized on the issue of COVID-19, specifically on vaccination status versus unvaccination status. And you've got people now within the federal regime that are coming out and saying that if you are unvaccinated, you are the problem, you are scapegoated. Jacinda, the Prime Minister from New Zealand, was asked about this, and they said, are you creating a two-tier society where there is one rung of citizens that has less rights, right? They are second-class citizens with less rights than the people who have become vaccinated. And she said, yes. Yes, we are. We positively are doing this. And so whether or not your vaccination status is this or that, whatever, listen to your doctor, do your thing. But I'm not going to sit here, and I don't think any of us should sit here, and look at a country that becomes so incredibly polarized where we take a group of people, it is a smaller group of people, by the way, and then blame all the ills of society on them. This has been done throughout history when regimes become decrepit, when they feel threatened, and they come up with these scapegoat targets, and it never ends well. It always ends horribly.
I think there's something else to that, Jack. And actually, we talked about it on my show yesterday, which was, it was a comment that I had just gotten. And I hear this all the time in regards to COVID-19, which is the idea that someone had said, well, true patriots care more about public health than they do about individual freedom. And I hear that so often, is that people are like, you are not patriotic if you don't care about the common good. If you care about the common good, you will do this for your neighbor. You will wear the mask. You will get vaccinated. You will do all these things. And I really do hear that so often, that there are these two lines of thought that, like, well, you're not patriotic unless you put the greater good first. Even though when you look back at the collectivist mentality, that's never been what America has stood for. That's never been what America was founded on. And yet somehow here we are finding ourselves with these people who have been conditioned to view their freedoms as selfish. And I think it's a really dangerous time.
I think we've absolutely been collectivists in the past. We literally had a draft where we forced young men who were 18 years old to go overseas and fight to the death in wars. I would say that we had an office of censorship around World War II, where we were literally disallowing people casting baseball games to talk about the weather because we didn't want, foreign enemies to have any sort of information coming into the United States. I think that there's always been like a healthy balance between, these are our private liberties, but as we tell our children, with, more freedoms comes more responsibilities. You want to drive, that's fine. You can't drink and drive. If you want to, stay out late, that's fine, but you've got to call and check in. Like, it's always been historically, whether we're talking to our children or our fellow countrymen, that with additional freedoms is always necessarily going to come additional responsibilities, because you just can't have an anarchist society with everybody running around doing as they will and saying, we have freedom, because freedom is really only as good as the people around you ensure it is, Like, you can have an ultimately free society that, at the end of the day, you don't have the ability to do anything inside. So whether that's a pandemic and you're immunocompromised and now you can't go anywhere because nobody wants to do anything to, take care of themselves or take care of you to make sure that you don't get sick, or, whether that's, driving on the road and other people are drunk driving because we decide, well, they can drunk drive, but if they get in an accident, that's where we're going to punish them. I think that we always accept some level of limits on our freedom. If we want to say also that there's like a two-tier system being created between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated, I mean, I guess we can say that, but that system was created a long time ago. We've had that for a long time. In order to go to public schools, and most
That's
private
not
schools
true. That's completely not true.
Wait, do you require vaccinations to attend most schools?
Did they check a vaccination status when we got into this theater? When you went to a supermarket? When you went to?
I would argue going to school is more
everywhere.
important than going to the theater. Or
There are
supermarket.
most states have exemptions.
This is Mott and Bailey, right? We're not talking about those vaccines. We're talking about this vaccine.
And I'm just saying, if you to utter the phrase, we're creating a two-tier system between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, that's already existing.
There's a crucial distinction.
It's actually happening.
Absolutely. You cannot go to public schools and most private schools unless you are vaccinated, and you have to show a record of that.
So
but
I'd
all
like to
vaccines are the
just
same thing.
correct, but on top of that, most states in this country offer a wide variety of exemptions for parents to fill out. I know because I do them. It's very easy. I go to my state's registrar, the Department of Health. I go fill out my information. They send me a form. I go get it notarized saying I don't want my children to be vaccinated for whatever reason I so choose, my personal conscience. I believe that it's New York and California who are the only ones who have done away with everything except medical, but medical still remains. So the idea that I can't send my kids to public school or private school unless they're vaccinated is absolutely untrue. I know because I do it.
There's an exemption process, though. My understanding for the COVID-19 vaccine as well, though. Yes, you're allowed to get tested, and you can show that you've been tested.
Many employers are not
though.
accepting that
Yeah,
exemption. But I have a question. Do you believe, Stephen, that you don't believe that there's an attempt to use vaccine status to divide us in this country? You don't think that's happening?
I think at this point you could literally tell people to stop shitting in the streets, and Republicans will pull down their pants and run up and down and do it. I think that people are looking for divisions in any possible place you can find it. I guess as an American citizen, I think that we have access to a wonderful society, but there's going to be some buy-in to that society. Whether it triggers people or not, like paying taxes is part of your obligation to society. You know, being a good neighbor is part of your obligation to society. Taking the bare minimum steps to ensure that you're not transmitting a deadly disease over and over and over again to other people is like the bare minimum step you can take in society. I think it's a fair.
What does being a good neighbor mean, though? That means different things to different people, right? Like when you're saying,
that's what we vote on.
But when you're saying it's my responsibility, public health is my responsibility, it is not my responsibility that we have an obesity crisis in this nation. I have not forced people to go and make themselves.
Obesity is not contagious.
But it makes people more prone to getting COVID, which means that
not contagious.
But if you have made yourself have comorbidities to something that is going around, how is that my responsibility?
I mean, we can talk about reasonable steps you can take to prevent one from getting sick. I don't know if I would say that like every single person
wasn't
needs
your
to
argument.
live.
People don't take care of their own bodies.
I don't think we can say every single person has to live an optimally healthy life. Otherwise, it's your responsibility.
Right, but that wasn't
when it
your
comes to something like
argument.
a
Your argument
vaccine,
was
when it comes to something like a
public
vaccine,
By the way, can you guys see why I brought up
vaccines?
vaccines? Because like this was kind of, we were kind of like just chilling up here, and then I was like, let's talk about something.
He wanted to make it interesting.
Actually, this I think goes to your
We are
point.
going to now
suddenly
speak of
it's
the
very
vaccine. We are going to have a lively argument and discussion for your viewing pleasure.
Suddenly, it's very contentious.
Yeah,
okay?
I do have a point about that because you brought up the in order to go to public schools, and true, we require most kids. There are exceptions to get vaccinated for public schools, but what do we require them to get vaccinated for? Diseases that are either more contagious than COVID and diseases that are more deadly for children than COVID. Like we don't require flu shots every year for kids to go to public schools, and COVID for kids in that age is about as dangerous as the flu.
Nor
like,
did
if
we
you want to
require
compare this
masks.
to a smallpox vaccine, smallpox's fatality rate was 30%. It was a worldwide pandemic, or a worldwide plague on humanity. These two things are not comparable. So
I agree that we don't require flu shots, but if the flu was killing, 500,000 people in
the
a
flu
year,
kills
It
more
does.
children than.
Hold on. The flu fatality rates are nowhere near the SARS-CoV-2.
He's talking about for
We're
children.
talking about children because
Sure.
you brought up
But
schools.
we're not. But you don't get vaccinated just for children. I don't know why conservatives are so short-sighted when it comes to public health. You don't get shot just for the children. You get shot to protect their families, to protect their teachers, to protect other people in society. This is how vaccinations work. Vaccinations are not an individual protection measure. It is a societal epidemiological health prescription.
Just to
That's
get
how
us
they
back
work.
on subject for a
So
second.
vaccinate them.
I'm curious, because we all seem to be, at least I thought we were in agreement on several things until we got to this very divisive issue of
Psych.
vaccines. But I'm just curious, do you believe that there's a concerted effort in this country to divide the populace along issues like race, for example, using race, for example, to divide us, using the vaccine to divide us, using partisanship,
I mean, I think the division is a byproduct of other goals. I don't think the goal is explicitly like, we're going to divide with this issue and focus on it. I think that people have issues that they care about a lot, and then people end up being divided on it. So whether we're talking about people on the left dividing people with the coronavirus or Republicans dividing people with abortion, I don't think anybody's goal is to divide somebody with a topic. It's just you have things you care a lot about, and then you push it, and those topics end up becoming divisive because people disagree with them.
Look, I think people's uninformed nature leads to bad policy and authoritarian policy. We've seen the polling that a bunch of people in this country think that the hospitalization rate for COVID-19 is over 50%, over 30%. So, like, people think that COVID sends you to the hospital like smallpox. I understand why they're pressuring their governments to pass regulations to treat it like smallpox.
Russ Doe had a column in the New York Times where he was saying that what if COVID was 10 times more deadly? And my response was like, well, yeah, then I'd be there with you, right? That I would understand some of this stuff, and we could take those steps, right? If it was as deadly as smallpox, then yes, certainly we would be using much more drastic measures. But when it comes to this, I find it very interesting that we argue more about the effects of the steps that we're going to be taking on this, rather than, for me, I've been a big, proponent of understanding where COVID came from, understanding this process, the NIH process, and looking into, early January 2020, I was like one of the first guys in the country who was reading the Mandarin on various Chinese blogs, trying to figure out what the heck was going on in Wuhan, and then digging into the lab and everything else. And it's amazing to me how that, which really seems like something the country could unite on, and I don't mean to drive the conversation into this, that has been completely usurped by instead, no, we're going to have these divisive mandates. And it's amazing to me that when I see Joe Biden, every time he announces a mandate, it's because he's trying to distract from something that's just happened. So Afghanistan falls apart. He announces he's going to push nationwide mandates. Then he has a political loss. He's suffering badly in the polls. He announces that OSHA is going to fund, just this last week, right, is going to push the new rule. 49 pages, the thing comes out, everyone's going to be fined. And so everybody then goes and talks about the mandates. At the same time, you're seeing the ordering of vaccinations for children in New York State. And so it's looking at it again, like, because I do look at everything through the regime, not everything, but I look at a lot of this through the politics of, or the lens of regime politics, that you can really see that a lot of what the regime, and to your point, I do think that this is something that a lot of people care about, but I can see that the way that the timing of these orders is really being pushed to help benefit the regime in terms of the larger narrative war.
I would also say that the idea that I am supposed to put my child at risk, because there is risk to both things, right? If you want to say there is risk that my child might be one of the few who gets COVID-19 and has some sort of long-term complications or, passes away, there's risk there. There is also a risk when you are talking about a medicine, a drug that you are injecting into your body. And I just think the idea that I am supposed to put my child at risk for a stranger at the supermarket that I don't even know, I am beholden to some stranger in society more so than I am to my own family, is absolutely preposterous.
I mean, you can play that on both sides, though. Maybe you think you don't want to put your child. I wouldn't want to put my child at risk being in a classroom with your child. I don't want my child to contract something that
then
they might
stay
have gotten.
home.
I don't want.
Then
no,
stay
no,
home.
No, but your child is the problem, not mine. Because I'm
It's
willing
not,
for
though.
my child to
You
take the
can't
minimum
spread a
number of
virus
steps
that you don't
necessary.
have.
I'm willing to have my child take the minimum steps necessary to make sure that they're safe and they protect their classmates as well. I'm guessing you're probably against children wearing masks too, or other types of.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so
It's abusive. It's abusive.
But the problem is
My child never wore a mask.
If my child catches something or gets something because another student isn't taking the minimum preventative risks, and we know that children are pretty tenacious when it comes to the coronavirus, they're probably not going to die. They're probably not even going to get seriously ill. But if they bring that home to grandma and grandpa, and now grandma and grandpa died because you decided to fill out a bullshit exemption for your kid because you didn't want them to get a vaccination because of a stranger in a supermarket, right? That's just absolutely absurd.
Okay, so hold on. So here's the thing. It's if your mask works, if your vaccine works, if your child's vaccine works, you shouldn't have to worry about my child.
What?
My child is not a threat to you.
I don't.
If you believe in your science, then believe in your science. You're fine. And if you don't and you're worried about my child, what does that say?
I cannot understand how conservatives are so bad with probability. It absolutely blows my mind.
Why do you keep saying
if your seatbelt
conservatives?
works, why do you have an airbag? If your airbag works, why does your car crumple? If this all works, why do you care about other drunk drivers? Like,
No.
you can make the
That's
dumbest
for-
face in
that's-
one in the world, but this every single
That's
thing
not
that
at
you
all
do, it
a great
absolutely
analogy.
is completely one-to-one in comparison. The things that you do epidemiologically is not we're going to do this one thing and 100% prevent the virus, and if we don't, it's a failure. It's all the little steps that you take on the way. If everybody social distance and mask, you prevent the spread this much. If everybody did that and then got vaccinated, you prevent it this much. If everybody stays home, this is how it works. All of it is probabilistic. This idea that, well, you've got something that increases your probability by this percent, so now nobody has to do anything. It's the dumbest look at
So if you are living in a free society, if you choose to live in a free society and you choose to go into society, you are accepting the risk that you will get a transmissible disease every time you exit your home. That is how a free society works. You will never vaccinate every virus out of the population. You will always have sickness and we will always transmit diseases because that's just the way a free society works. So if you are worried about what everyone else is transmitting, you are the one who should stay at home.
So
because
we don't
how
live-
we've always lived, we've always transmitted flu at the supermarket. No one's been worried about that.
we
We've
don't live-
always
we don't-
transmitted diseases.
We don't
No
live
one's
in a,
been worried
we don't
about
live
it.
in a free society. We live in a democratically elected representative government. So if most of the public decides that these mandates are indeed necessary for you to participate in society, then you are the one that is going to have to abide by what the public
So
calls
what if
for.
the majority
That is how
believe
our
that?
government works. That's how our
Let me
system
ask
works.
a
We're in a
question.
democratically elected republic. That's how it works.
How do you define rights? I'd like to know how you define rights. Like this will actually get us back on topic a little bit. Where do rights come from? Because it sounds to me...
There's a whole other conversation on, do we believe rights come from God? Do we believe they come from government? Do we talk about
But
positive
it
rights
sounds
versus
to me
negative
like
rights?
you're saying it's within your right for the majority to dictate force against others. So, for example, if the majority of people say we should enslave people, then we should enslave people.
So
Is
we
that
can
what
have,
you're saying?
we have edged out in our Constitution. There are going to be minimums, or there are going to be certain inalienable rights that we cannot take from other people, and that's up to the courts to decide,
Bodily
or us
autonomy?
to change the Constitution. Otherwise, right? You can say bodily autonomy you want, but vaccinations are required for children going to public schools,
Yeah,
right?
what we discussed
the point
that,
is that rights exist on paper. Okay, it doesn't matter what right we talk about if we can't leave our house because we're worried about something, or if we can't go. Now, I'm not saying that the coronavirus is so
choice.
bad that you can never leave the house. I'm just saying that in order for society to function, we don't all work in this ultimately free way. We have a responsibility to other people around us. Conservatives should understand this the best because conservatives are the most local people that tend to participate locally in their churches, in their charities. They give more than liberals do. You guys should know this better than anyone else, and that in order for society to function, to be well lubricated, to not have a lot of friction, you have to have some minimum level of buy-in in terms of how you treat the people around you. One of the ways you treat people nice is by not volunteering as a bioterrorism weapon because you don't want to get vaccinated because of something that fucking Anderson Cooper said on CNN.
For someone who claims that conservatives have a hard time believing in science, you seem to not understand the idea that no one can spread a virus that they don't have.
And also, my rights aren't...
I'm not a bioterrorist weapon by going to the grocery store if I don't have a virus. Your assumption
every day to know, wait, I don't even
your
understand
assumption that everyone else you come into contact with, if they are not vaccinated, must have COVID is ridiculous.
But there's an increased probability.
No, but
works.
like my rights are not subject to your inability to assess risk properly. You're talking about people afraid to leave their homes because of the coronavirus.
I literally
You're talking
said I
about
didn't
children being afraid to go to school, or parents afraid for their children to go to school. The risk is near zero. Also, when Biden was announcing the vaccine mandates and what he was proposing, he said breakthrough cases were 1 in 5,000. Breakthrough hospitalizations, again from the president, were 1 in 160,000. I think 1 in 160,000 is not enough to infringe on other people's rights. Jack said it earlier. If COVID was 10 times, 20 times more deadly and more deadly for children, we'd be having a different conversation. But we need to assess the
You also
risk.
wouldn't have to mandate it.
The answer to this is simple.
You wouldn't have to mandate it. People would go get it.
You vaccinate, everyone vaccinates, then you will plug into Zuckerverse, and in Zuckerverse we will all vaccinate each other multiple times a day. You'll be taking every new vaccine, then the pill comes out, the injections will continue until compliance has been achieved.
So just to attempt to get us back on topic.
But there is
once more.
there is
No.
a bigger question here, right? And I think we should separate the two over like, are vaccines good versus should vaccines be mandated, right? Isn't that I mean, that's like two separate
Right.
things, right?
Correct.
I think it boils down to, do you believe, we'll have time for questions in just 1 second, but do you believe that the government,
Be very
some
quiet,
people
audience.
phrase
We
it
don't
this
want to
way,
hear from
do
you.
you believe that the government owns individuals or individuals own themselves? And is this a part of our American narrative that we've lost? Like, what did the founders intend when they talk about liberty? When I asked the first question on this panel, like, how do you define the founding principles if you were to explain them to a child? Like, what is America? What does it mean to be an American? Does anybody have an answer for that?
Well,
How do you define
There
it?
are no rights. Rights come from me if I give them to you. You're not allowed to have these silly things. You're silly people. There are no rights. The government has rights, and you are children who will obey what we tell you. We might make you think you have the right to vote for this approved candidate or that approved candidate, or have arguments from this approved source and that approved source asking this approved question or that approved question, but at the end of the day, you have nothing. This is silly.
Jack has the weirdest filibusters. I was gonna say, I think fundamentally, like the American identity, like we should all have an understanding of what like the principles of America mean. Like I want to move past that. I think fundamentally what separates Americans from other peoples in other nations around the world is that we have like an optimistic mindset, and this is in part due to our structure of government. Like people always say, we're the first nation to put freedom of religion in the Constitution. We're also the first nation to put intellectual property rights in the Constitution, because the idea of America is that if you invent it, you own it, you take it as far as you can take it, because it's your adventure. And we see the American optimism in different aspects of our lives. Go watch the ending of a British sitcom. The joke is always on the main character. American sitcoms always uplift the main character. This is because fundamentally we're an optimistic people, and we shouldn't lose the fact that we're an optimistic people. The Hollywood ending, when Hollywood used to reflect our values more, is a thing because that is reflective of our American values, that we want the hero to win. We want, like, we're rooting for good over evil, not to make it so dramatic like that. That's not the same in other nations, and I see us becoming more cynical, less optimistic, talking about subversive things like national divorce, just giving up, packing it in, dividing up the country as if that's not going to lead to a civil war. So we got to hold on to that optimistic ideal, because that's what America is. It's the adventure, not the result.
There's a great kind of like it's one of those memes that's out there, and it's it's talking about the differences in literature. So for different societies, and so the stereotypical American, it's it's like, I will die for liberty, right? And then it's got the British, British literature, I will die for honor, and then the French, of course, I will die for love, and then the Russian is like, I will die. And it's sort of this like very cynical, very Eastern, kind of thinking. And, I do feel though that we have lost kind of that American sort of sense of, if I have liberty, it's not just liberty for, the sake of being able to do whatever I feel like. It's liberty, it's what you say, to achieve those optimistic goals, to achieve those optimistic ends, because we don't want to be stuck in the pod eating the bugs. We want to be adventurous and take risks. If everyone here, right, unless you're native, your parents came, or if you are native, if you go back, that your parents came or your ancestors came on a dangerous and arduous voyage to get here. So we were self-selected to be part of this experiment, over time. And I think we all do come from that stock. And so adventure seeking, we're in Texas, right? This is the home of the cowboy, right? What is the more American stereotypical archetype than the cowboy, riding out with, the 10-gallon hat and being on the range? This is the American figure. Now, look, I'm a Philadelphia area, I'm not a cowboy, but that there is, a huge part of the American mythos that's tied up in that. And it's a figure that people strive to kind of emulate. And I think that we have lost, getting back to the original question, we have lost that as a country, totally lost that as a country.
I will say, just as a quick note, that your go-to example for like American values was what came from Mexican cowboys. I think that's kind of funny. But regardless of that, I think that we talk a lot about liberty in terms of what are we guaranteed on paper? What can we do on paper? I wish that the conversation would move past that, because it is so unbelievably boring to hear about how much opportunity you have on paper if you don't actually have the opportunity in real life. You know, like, it's when you can go to so many different countries across Europe and people have access to education, they have access to healthcare, they might have to wait in line for it, but they get it. When they have access to like actual opportunity, and then we brag, well, you know, in the United States, you could go from selling crack to, you know, being the CEO of a major company. I find those conversations wholly unsatisfying. I wish that we would talk more about how do we actually ensure that people have actual real access to opportunity, rather than jerking ourselves off about, like, you know, words on paper that don't mean much for a lot of the American public right now. We talk about how the public is like, in the United States, generally optimistic, and then, you know, we try to use like British cynicism to say they want evil to win over good. I don't know if I agree with that. But I mean, if you want to look for optimism, I mean, look at like the millennial crowd that came up after one of the worst recessions in U.S. history. Or look at people right now that can't afford to move to another city to get a job. Or look at people that can't afford to go to college. Or look at people that you know, feel like they have to live with their parents till they're 30 years old. I think that we have problems in this country that go past just the wording in the Constitution, and it seems like we're unwilling to come together to acknowledge that reality from the left and right, and actually like work to fix those problems.
I would say I think that we would acknowledge that there are problems that exist. I think that we would just disagree on the reason for the problem, is I think the issue. I mean, I agree. I think it's, when my kids get that old, I sure as hell don't want them living with me, right? Like, I understand the problem of millennials having to live with their parents, but why is that? I would argue that we have a generation of people growing up who are entitled, who don't understand how to spend money, who spend themselves into debt, who don't understand financial responsibility, and that those are the reasons driving what you just mentioned, right?
Where do they get those values
well,
from?
I'm not done, but as you're about to do, you would argue that it's something different, right? But what I'm saying is, I don't think that we disagree that there's a problem. We disagree on the root cause of the problem.
I just want to point out that one person clapped for, there is no opportunity, and I found that hilarious.
No, I think you're right though when you say that it's a knock on conservatives, and I think it's a good one. Like, I give you credit for saying it. That, you know, conservatives will just kind of like be in this sort of like you're stuck in one of those C++ routines, you know, if you know anything about coding, where you're just like the Constitution over and over. Whereas for, you know, huge swaths of the country, they're saying, look, you know, my job went overseas and my town died because the factory closed, and I don't know what I'm going to do to feed my family, and this town is like falling apart. And so, you know, you telling me, hey, the Constitution, bro, right? It doesn't really do much to help me and help my family. Or, you know, if you're younger, it doesn't really help my prospects. And you talked about millennials as well. And I think that, you know, as someone, I was born in '84, so we're sort of like the elder millennial, centennial kind of thing. And, you know, you look at, if you came of age during, you know, the financial crisis, like you were in debt, you were not getting a job, basically, you know, a lot of people then went back to school, they continued to get more into debt, and a lot of this stuff was driven by insane speculation on Wall Street, which was, of course, provided for them by the government. Nobody went to jail for any of this stuff. And the way that people decided to fix the system was to take away, like strip ownership away from, you know, millennials, Zoomers, and the rest of it, and to say, well, maybe home ownership isn't something. No, home ownership, of course, was what was the traditional, we talked about the American archetype being the cowboy, but what is the American dream? Right? The American dream used to be owning your own home. This was like the synonymous thing everyone was told, and that, you know, the path was laid out. Go to school, get your bachelor's degree, get a job, get a wife, have some kids, boom, there's your house, you're good to go, right? That's totally been broken, and it's been broken for a long time. And a lot of Republicans are running around thinking it's still the 1980s and using these boring, I agree with you, like boring arguments, and not talking about what's actually happening, because you see the same financial institutions and the same government institutions coming in and saying the problem with all of this was those stupid people thinking that they could own their own homes. We need to take that away from them. We need to take ownership away from them, take away the ability for them to build that generational wealth that they could actually then use, you know, to seek. You talk about opportunities, but, you know, you're exactly right that there's so many challenges that have been put in place by this system, this corrupt system, that's preventing people from actually achieving any of these ends that we'd really like for there to be. But it isn't just, you know, their beliefs, and it isn't just not understanding the Constitution. It's actual huge structural problems in our country.
Look, I would agree that there are problems in the country, but the reason I'm emphasizing that America is about the adventure, and I didn't say Constitution, bro.
No,
is
no,
because,
I'm not
I
meaning you. I
I'm
don't
just
mean you.
saying, like, I specifically didn't do that.
But I did mean you.
Like,
You fool.
I feel sympathetic for a lot of small town America, and there are some instances where small town America has like fallen apart not due to circumstances not their own. I mean, the fact that we allowed pain pills to flood this nation and then cut them off, and that led to disaster.
Thanks, Frank Luntz.
Yeah, everybody understands that. But like, we have to also understand that the reason the Rust Belt existed, all those areas had manufacturing, is not because it was ordained by God that manufacturing would be there. It's because they had access to waterways, and it was expensive as hell to transport anything in this country or anywhere by ground transportation. If you were to ship a product from Pittsburgh to New York, which is only 300 miles over ground, you would send it on rivers down to the Mississippi, out of the port of New Orleans, up the East Coast, into New York's port. So what happened in the 70s was not like a giant conspiracy. It was that somebody invented two things. One, we ground transportation got less expensive. There was containerization, so you could ship stuff over large portions of the country. And two, we invented air conditioning, which is awesome. The reason we're all here in Texas is because of air conditioning. You know what else was allowed to come to Texas because of air conditioning? Manufacturing. This is why, like, the death of Michigan coincides not with the rise of these foreign auto companies, although that did play a part. Competition is a real thing, but it coincides with the rise of Auto Alley in South Carolina. So we can talk about like restoring Michigan and restoring all of these like different places, but in reality, the major problems that they have are problems of them passing laws based on their natural advantages that no longer exist anymore, and people should move when the jobs move. Like, there is too much complacency in this country. Like, it's just a fact.
I think there's also an issue, too, when we talk about some of the older values that were sold. I think to some extent we have to acknowledge that as we continue to grow as a country, it's not going to be possible to do these things. You know, if you want to buy a house and have a family and be able to afford all of that off of a single job today, people will tell you it's impossible, but it's totally possible. You just have to move to Montana or Wyoming to do it. You're not going to be able to go to LA. You're not going to be able to go to New York. You're not going to be able to go to Miami. You're not going to be able to go to San Francisco and have the single family home off the one job and the mom at home staying with the kids, because it's just not affordable. It's not possible. We have so many people that live in this country today and so many people that want to move into cities. If you're trying to sell them simultaneously this idea that they can have the single family home and the white picket fence while also living in the most economically prosperous areas in the United States, it's a physics problem. You just can't do it.
No. Move to Houston if you want to do that. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States of America, and incomes grow faster than the cost of living up until they had a bunch of transplants from New Orleans, but even that is correcting. The reason why is because Houston has no zoning regulations. So if you want to live next to a parking lot in your cul-de-sac, like, that's totally dope. You can see those images online. But also Dallas-Fort Worth area is very inexpensive because they have virtually no zoning regulations. Like, the reason you can't afford to live in San Francisco or New York, and I live in New York and I can't afford to live there, is because of zoning regulations, it's because of open space laws, all of these restrictions that people who live there are imposing on people who could move there because they want to have a nice little bit of scenery that they can look at. Well, I'm a capitalist. If you want scenery, buy that property that has the scenery and you pay for it. Don't vote to keep future generations out. Like, that is a complete violation of our rights to due process and equal protection under the law, that just because you showed up first, you can vote to ban these other people. But yeah, if you want to move to a big, growing city, Houston is the one.
I think.
I mean Dallas. Dallas, Fort Worth.
Go Cowboys.
Found the Dallas. Yeah.
You'll have to get your passport from me.
Yeah, that got more of a boo than the Eagles thing.
So I've got a final question, then we're going to go to a Q&A. And this brings up something you've mentioned, Sean. Comedian Sarah Silverman recently has talked about the possibility of a national divorce. It's a phrase that I'm hearing more in popular culture in the past 6 months. And we're sitting here in the great state of Texas, which has a growing favorability rate for the Texit movement. My question is, do you think we're at a place where the political and cultural divide is so great that it would be better to have an amicable parting of ways? And make your case to me either way, because my mind is not yet made up.
Listen, there's no such thing as an amicable parting of ways. That's live action role playing. Stop doing it. And if you think there is, please draw me the map of how we divide up the Mississippi River, because international trade still requires water-based transportation. So show me your map of the United States where the coasts are given to the left and the interior has to use the network of rivers to go to the Mississippi to get out of the port of New Orleans, that's going to make sense and not lead to a civil war. It's nonsense, it's subversive, and I'm not in for it.
Yeah, I have two really quick takes on the national divorce thing. Number one is that we're probably not going to get a national divorce. We'll have more like a national separation. Like, we're still living under the same roof for the sake of the normies, but we're sleeping in separate bedrooms. We're dating other people. It's just but we got to stay together for the sake of the normies, so we don't go down that road. But then number two is that I find it very interesting, just from sociological perspective, that every single person I see who's totally for a national divorce, I'm definitely not one of them, but they're all Gen Xers. And it's like, divorce is the answer for everything for Gen X, right? Just get divorced, man. Just walk, bro. Just get out of there. And it's like, it's such a Gen X thing. And so what's interesting is that, as that sort of cusp, centennial generation, it's sort of like, we have we're not quite as, what is it? We still have like youthful hope in the sort of elder millennial area, but we also we don't get the cynicism and the jadedness of Gen X.
I think if I were to imagine that you said amicable, if I were to imagine that it could be amicable, which I agree with Sean, I don't think that it could be when you're really looking at the details and the logistics of it. There are days where I wake up and I say, I'm really tired of being hated. I'm really tired of being told I'm a bioterrorist threat. I'm really tired of my children being told that they're a bioterrorist threat. I'd really love to live with my own people, and I would love that. But I think when you look at the logistics of it, I'm just not sure that it's possible. I will say, when you mentioned Texit, I did see my friend Chad Prather. I know he's coming up later. I would just like to say he is running for governor. And if you want to know about Texit, you should ask him more about that. But I don't know how possible it is, but I will admit, in my weaker moments, there are days where I'm like, I'm just kind of done being hated. I would much prefer rejoining with the people who believe in the foundational principles of this country.
I think it's LARPing cringe. I think most people up here seem it's LARPing, live action roleplay. You pretend it's not going to happen. Logistically, it doesn't make any sense. I haven't seen people talking about it seriously, but I'd be curious what those maps look like too, because I feel like people miss that one of the big divides in this country, it's really not so much red states and blue states, although those exist, but it's like blue cities and red rural areas. And I think that when that's your largest divide, I don't even know how you'd go about cutting up the map to figure out who would be in which area and how it seems completely impossible.
We also have quite a division between people who can defend themselves and people who can't. So people who can defend themselves, and we've seen this historically throughout cultures, will tend to think freely because they don't they're not seeking consensus. So if they're saying something, it's, am I saying this because it is true, versus if you're someone who can't defend yourself, you're thinking, can I say this because it will be accepted by the collective?
And if you want to wrestle more local control, I know you have to go to questions, then put that energy into repealing the 17th Amendment. Most of the problems in our country that we're all concerned about power drifting to the federal government, are due to the fact that we directly elect our senators and their federal entities. There's a reason all these court nominees were confirmed by the state's representative senates, because the state legislatures used to send the senators. It's because the courts are meant to adjudicate disputes between the states and the federal government. So you have the president, an agent of the federal government, appoint and confirmed by the senators, who are agents of the states. We don't have that, and we wonder why power keeps trickling up to the federal government. We removed a major check and balance in our federal government, and we pretend I wonder why things are going that way.
I mean, that's really what I mean by national separation. Empower the states. National separation, it also used to be called federalism, which is something we had in this country.
We're going to go to Q&A, but I'm going to ask one quick question. You have 10 seconds, Stephen. What is the what is the unifying narrative for this country if we are going to stay together?
I have no idea. I don't think there is a unified narrative for the United States. No.
Let's start with questions.
Well, on behalf of all the Gen Xers, I am not jaded. Very excited to be here. I'm a Built Bar rapper. I wanted to give it to you, Sarah, but I ate it. Sorry about that. Just to get back to the most contentious thing, because I really see it in Dallas, and I'm from California, dividing us is, how can you, Sara, and Steve, is it Steve? Be together, live together, commune together when you do not want to get the vax and will not get the vax, and your children won't, and they won't wear the masks, and you seriously believe that it's a major health issue and that, you're a bioterrorist. How do you get that to work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Stephen would have a different answer than I would, but I would argue that that's just how we've been living in society this whole time, and it should work no differently than we've been living in society this entire time. We all make different choices for our own bodies. We all can make those choices. We all have the ability to make those choices, and I'm not going to judge someone for getting the vaccine. I don't think anyone should judge me for not getting the vaccine because, again, we live in a society where risk of transmitting disease is literally always going to be 100%. We are always going to transmit diseases. I'm willing to understand that and accept the risks. If someone else isn't willing to understand that and accept the risks, there's only so much I can do. So I'm happy to live with people who do or don't or whatever. In fact, I don't care to know their medical status. And I think that that's the problem, is that you have one side of the aisle who says, I actually don't really care about your medical privacy. I believe that that should stay private. And then there is one side of the aisle who, again, thinks that I am a bioterrorist threat. So I hope he has a great answer for how we can come together, because I would love to hear it.
So I am absolutely judgmental, very much so, people that I disagree with. However, in the United States, you have two options, basically. So we live in a democracy. I've said this over and over again. I'll continue to say it.
It's a
I can push
constitutional
for the
republic.
things that I believe in, and I can hope that those policies are popular enough to get elected. If the ones that I agree with don't get enacted, I have two options. I either abide by it, and you do it, and there are policies that I disagree with, and you abide by it, and that's how it goes. Or you take your child out, or you remove yourself from whatever situation it is that you don't agree with. If I think that the way that speed limits are done in a way that I don't agree with, then stop driving. Or if you think that the way, if I felt very strongly about vaccine mandates for children and they weren't mandated, then you take your child out of school and you do homeschooling, right?
Well, would you agree, though, that if we had, like what Sean and I are saying, that if we had more empowered states and that it wasn't a federal thing, that, if there were a state law that said that, and, go with the moving, that, hey, I want to live in a state where my policies are more accepted versus coming to a place like Texas or, wherever, like Texas versus California kind of question. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, states have a right. I mean, it has to be decided on a legal battle. I don't know where the rights of the states end and the federal governments begin when it comes to matters of public health or whatnot. But I mean, that's something that the courts fight about. But yeah, I mean, some states have different laws for different things, and obviously you respect the different laws of the different states depending on where you live. Yeah.
I believe the precedent that's often cited for why the vaccine mandates are constitutional is a state vaccine
It is,
mandate.
yeah.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
The central principle is consent of the governed. That's the most important phrase. Consent of the governed, that's the most important phrase in the Declaration of Independence. That's the basis of the Constitution. It requires accountability, which nobody out here, whether you're left or right, is actually seeing in our government. And with accountability, you get credibility, which also is what's lacking with regard to our government. And nobody out here actually thinks that the government gives a damn what we think. The mandate was not part of the last presidential election. Nobody ran on it. Nobody voted for it. So my question is, can y'all agree that consent of the governed and the rules that we play by is actually the way to get back to where we need to be?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you absolutely do consent. Every single decree of the United States government is not voted on by direct democracy. We vote for people that represent us, and then we hope that they enact whatever agenda that we agree with. If we don't, then you go and you vote them out next legislative session. But the idea that just because the president is enacting something or something comes from Congress that we don't directly vote on, it's not the will of the people, I think that betrays a misunderstanding of how our federal government is supposed to work.
Yeah, I would actually agree. I would agree with that to a certain extent. The idea that if something is not in a campaign or in a platform, therefore you didn't consent to it. It's like, no, we do have a representative republic. So you send representatives for a period of time. They don't have to tell you literally everything they do. They should, but you have the opportunity to punish them at the ballot box. However, we have a system where supposedly, allegedly, theoretically, the legislature makes laws, and the president shouldn't be able to look at an OSHA regulation that has to do with people wearing hard hats and say that that applies to a national vaccine mandate. So
You stupid people.
so we
You
don't
think you have rights again. You have none. You have nothing. We'll mandate everything for you from now on. This is how it goes.
By the way, just to add to Sean's point, these are, and it's not just the OSHA regulation, right? It's also the CDC being used as another arm to enforce the eviction moratorium. I mean, we're seeing these departments being abused, and admittedly, the Biden administration already said, yeah, this really isn't legal. We really shouldn't be doing this, but we're going to do it anyway. So, I mean, I would agree with you, Sean. I think, like, if we were to get back to the actual system that we were supposed to have with checks and balances and the legislature working as it's supposed to, then I think that would be way better than the system we have now, which is clearly an abuse of power.
I mean, we say abuse, but it's a conservative court right now. If you think that it's being abused, you challenge it legislatively. If the Supreme Court upholds it, then maybe these federal institutions had more power than we knew originally. Or maybe we should vote in Congress to remove some of the powers that are delegated to them. There's a great deal of deference given to executive agencies when it comes to how they want to implement or enact their particular laws. Maybe that could be scaled back on, but I don't like the idea of saying that, like, it's illegally used or it's not really legal. It's like, I mean, if you don't like it, you have a Supreme Court that is conservative, you can challenge it.
Right. Unfortunately, a Supreme Court case doesn't go there overnight, right? Like it takes time. Right. It takes time. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but there's not always an immediate fix.
A lot of the lefties, when they were against the wars, would talk about how the war wasn't declared and the president shouldn't just be able to do this, that, and the other. I agree with that in principle. Like, you can't transfer your duties to another branch of the government. That's not how checks and balances work. And the Supreme Court did shut down the eviction moratorium twice. Once they were like, you know what, we'll give Biden a little break. So it was a soft shutdown, and then he took advantage of that to expand it again. And he knew he had no authority, admitted it, he did it anyway.
All right. This question is for Destiny, Stephen, whichever you prefer. Do you believe that people on the right, including some of the people on this panel, actually believe that the left is goading them into extremism? Or do you think that they're intentionally lying to gaslight moderates and the left?
One of the hugest problems, what? Yeah, true, you are, am I right? I think it is absolutely fucking horrible how crazy everybody is on different sides of the political aisle. I will, unless I have a really good reason to believe so, I will never think that somebody is acting in some malicious or horrible manner. Like, I think that you probably genuinely do believe that you're doing what's best for your family and your children. I would hope so.
I know I am.
And I would assume the same of any conservative. I think that people on the left and people on the right all too often get into these mindsets where they're very quick to demonize or frame how other people are acting in the very worst of ways. But I mean, like, that's just the nature, unfortunately, of the political landscape.
You see this, Sean, you cannot simply run around calling everyone a pedophile.
Yeah, my question is actually for actual Justice Warrior. Earlier you were making a point about the left not understanding the right, and you cited a study from Dr. Jonathan Haidt about that. I was curious why you didn't mention the fact that that study actually said that everybody over-exaggerates the differences between everybody. It's just that mostly left people have larger discrepancies between those things. So if you were aware of that difference, the actual conclusion of the study, why didn't you say it? And if you don't know that, then why are you citing studies that you haven't read?
Okay. All right. So what he's talking about is there's Jonathan Haidt's research. They have people fill out surveys about their values as themselves and as other people, right? So obviously, this should go without saying, people aren't 100% and filling out the values when they fill them out as other people. But the overall conclusion, and this is in his book and it's in his research, is that the further left you are, the worse you are at identifying moderate or right-wing positions. So yeah, obviously they're not going to be 100% perfect, and being right-wing or being a centrist does not appear to give you a disadvantage in taking the place of somebody else. So that's why I didn't mention the thing that wasn't that relevant or interesting or compelling.
So this question is directed to both Sean and Stephen. This has to do with general trends that we're having. In 2020, Biden won about 53% of the vote, but he won 70% of the GDP. And more economic prosperity is concentrated in cities. And we're seeing such a huge rural and urban divide. Is the issue with the struggle with national discourse and national unity going to increase? And how are ways that we can fix that going forward?
There's an echo for us on the stage in hearing the question.
Yeah, when you guys speak into your mics, you have to speak
step
directly in, because it's really hard to hear it if it's not directly in.
Maybe step a little closer, actually. I think we could even hear you better.
All right, so the question has to do with more and more cities being concentrated centers for wealth, and those cities also being places for political polarization versus the rural area. Given the trends in our economy, this problem seems to be getting worse and worse. So how would we restructure maybe zoning laws, as AJW pointed out, or the way that we structure our country to kind of bring people together and increase political unity?
So I think it's basically, we're talking about how you're getting a greater concentration of people in cities, and how do you account for that, like in the way that your legislative body is made up? Was that that was kind of his question?
I thought he said concentrations of wealth are leading to polarization. Wealth and people, okay.
So I get a lot of heat over this. I really like our bicameral legislature. I like the idea that you have 2 senators from every state, that the state of Nebraska in the Senate has as much power as the state of California. I also like the idea that you have a House that makes it so that, like, 4 or 5 small states can't totally write new legislation for larger states as well. In terms of, like, how do you balance it when you go inside of a state and balance power between, like, cities and rural areas, I don't think that we should balance power based on, it sounded like you were implying that we should do it based on, like, wealth or GDP. I think that there's a lot of people that can offer a lot to the United States that don't just come down to the economic productive power because they happen to work in tech or finance or something else. So yeah, I don't know if I would restructure things based on those questions. We can always have arguments over how you draw districts or how that goes, but I think that largely speaking, I think that the American system with the way our government is set up right now actually works pretty well. But I think the problem is right now what it's expressing is how polarized the country is, which means the government is pretty ineffective at getting anything done, unfortunately.
And like you mentioned the zoning law specifically, one of the things that like restrictive zoning laws does is it makes it like basically not profitable to build any middle class housing. Like you can have a rich person in a luxury apartment and you're like, oh, you make way more money catering to them. But in reality, if you built a ton of apartments for like low to middle income people, you would probably make more money and you wouldn't be subject to the whims of that small group of people deciding that they want to leave for greener pastures. So the reason I don't need to get rid of every zoning regulation. I understand people want some control over their neighborhood and they don't want to look like some of the most ridiculous images of Houston, which by the way, look those up, they're hilarious. But like we can't let like people in California is one of the worst at this, like vote against people who want to move into their areas to ban every single project from ever being able to be built. Like it's a violation, in my opinion, of their rights because you're giving the current residents rights over people who are in the country and should have equal protection, and it just makes it impossible to afford to live in these places.
I think one of the other issues is the reason that you see a lot of concentration of wealth in the cities is something called the Cantillian Effect, and it's just it's very long, but you could summarize it by saying those closest to the money printer are the ones who benefit the most of it, as opposed to those furthest away who are impacted by higher inflation and the bullwhip effect of rising costs across the world. And so you see that as well in the cities, where so much of this wealth is essentially fake, because we have this system where you're putting massive amounts of money in at the top, it's benefiting those at the top, and then it trickles down, not very well, Reaganomics, whatever. Again, it's not the 1980s anymore, and I think you're seeing that more and more. So you shut down that system, and that'll actually help to ease some of these issues.
Alrighty, so Jack, you've kind of touched on this a couple times already, but I'd like to hear an expansion.
Can you put the mic up,
Yeah,
almost uncomfortably up, like eat it?
All right, is this better?
It is actually.
All right, so Jack has touched on this a couple times already, but I'd like to hear an expansion. Instead of a national divorce, can we just return to states' rights and rule and severely restrict federal power to minimal needs, and how can we effectively do that?
I would be totally in favor of that. I am all for that. How we do it is, I hope someone else can answer that one.
Repeal the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, well, how do we do that?
Have a constitutional convention.
Right,
like
but I'm just saying that the
Amendment.
likelihood of all of that happening is so slim. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be optimistic. We will totally get it done.
I think that there's a great amount of productive power that comes from like working as like one cohesive body rather than 50 separate states. I think there's always places where we can carve out more state rights for certain issues, but I mean to some extent it's probably good to have some like parity or equalization of like rights across different state borders. Sometimes it's a little weird that like, for instance, I can get arrested, like smoking marijuana in one state but not another, or I could smoke somewhere, or I can have a public drink somewhere and not other places. Like, I don't know. I think that hitting parity across some states for certain law, or or for some of you might know, like there are some states where you can ride without a helmet, and then as soon as you cross into another one, like state troopers will pull you over if you don't have a helmet on because of different rules. I think it's okay to have a high degree of mirroring of the laws between the states. Maybe we just carve out more individual state rights for things that we feel are important in the future.
Regarding democracy, is it okay if 90% of the population votes to, slaughter the other 10%? I mean, that's democracy, isn't it? I mean, how do you answer, when the German democracy invaded Poland and massacred 6 million Jews? I mean, democracy has no credibility anymore. I mean, democracy is, Australia. Democracy is, rounding up the Japanese in World War II. I mean, how do you answer all the disasters of democracy?
I do think, I mean, maybe that was directed at Stephen, but I do think but democracy is a terrible argument for like that reason. Obviously, we want limits. Even he would say he wants limits that respect the rights
like
of individuals.
Rights, right? Yeah, I mean, like, ideally, I mean, truly, if we're being honest with ourselves, nobody here would disagree that if 90% of the country wanted to do something, it would happen. Right? That's just if you have 90% of the people that want to do something, it's going to happen. 90% of the people want to do it. Ideally, the way that a democracy hopefully functions is you have some special protections carved out where people can't vote away the civil rights of other people. But I mean, a democracy is only as good as the people that vote in any given democracy. So there is no, I can't give you like a guarantee that like, well, this will never happen because I would be lying to say so.
So Destiny has confirmed that he's against 90% of South Africans voting to attack white farmers.
I guess so. I don't speak for South Africa's government. I speak for, sure.
All right, this question's for everyone, and it kind of has to do with a lot of issues, underlying seem to be with data, personal data, health data, DNA data, speech data, whether it's online, in public data. So do we need a new Bill of Rights for our digital data, for our digital footprint that we put out there in public and on the internet?
Absolutely not. This is hilarious. Your data is our data. You've given it yourself freely. You've given it to Zuckerberg, to Bezos, to everyone. Your data is now ours. There's no rule for this. You will not be given any control of your own data, your own power, your own life. You'll own nothing. You'll be happy. You'll be in Zuckerverse. You'll be given your injections on a bi-daily basis. Your data will be controlled, and your life will be planned out. It'll be very nice for you.
We have surprise panelists on this one.
I mean, I don't know that would take a brand new Bill of Rights, but I do agree with you that there is a lot of data that is going around that, a lot of people are making money off of, and it needs to be addressed. How that is addressed, I think, is, I don't know that we could get that done, but certainly something needs to be done.
I mean, I could see one written that I would support. I think the GDPR took good steps towards ensuring that you could keep track of what data a company has about you and have a right to have your data deleted after some period of time. So there's probably some legislation that we could come to an agreement on for like an Internet Bill of Rights. I don't know if I want like the median age 75-year-old congressperson figuring out like what Facebook memes should be banned or not. I don't know how I'd feel about that, but yeah, it probably would be a good idea to move in that direction.
If they can't log on to the computer by themselves, we don't want them making the rules, right?
So my question is to Jack, but anyone can answer. At the very, very beginning, it might have been in your opening statement, you either alluded to or directly said that the Boogaloo Boys were created by the feds in order to create some sort of narrative to keep them in power. Do you not think that the fact that people on both sides of the aisles, whether it's conservatives with the Boogaloo Boys not accepting that they're a real organization, or lefties with groups like the Black Hammer not accepting that they're real and that they're all just psyops, might be leading to a lack of cohesiveness in the U.S., not being able to call those things out for what they are?
I mean, did you have like a specific question, or? Yeah. I mean, I agree.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Then at the beginning, you referenced that, or you alluded to the fact that the Boogaloo Boys were feds. So my question is,
do you not think that that is damaging to discourse and to cohesiveness?
The Boogaloo Boys are definitely feds. Like, that's very obvious.
Wait, like all of them?
Very, no, not all of them. That's the way a federal operation works, right? You push this, there's a meme that gets pushed around, and then people get caught up in this thing, and then federal agents decide to go and pinpoint certain people. They did the exact same thing, by the way, to a lot of Muslim teenagers during the War on Terror who would be posting stuff, and, you know, there wasn't like the Facebook groups like it was like it is now, but they would catch some kid posting something online, and then they would reach out to him and say, hey man, I'm from Hezbollah, or I'm from the PLO, and I want you to come work with me, and we're gonna do this mission to save, you know, or to fight back against the US government, and it would go all along down the line until that person had committed what's called, you know, conspiracy to commit, you know, whatever it was, most likely terrorism if it was one of those cases, and then they would snatch him up, right? So it's an entrapment operation, and it's very clear that's very, very, very large amount of Boogaloos, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers. I'm not saying that it was that the forces behind what made people want to join, you know, a gun rights group, you know, is some kind of federal operation. Obviously not, right? And that makes people become anti-government. Obviously not. But I'm saying these groups are targeted, used, infiltrated, and then eventually people go to jail because of things that federal agents do to them.
Just to be clear on what entrapment is, because we use this term a lot, if somebody presents to you the opportunity to do a crime and you jump on it, that's not entrapment. Entrapment is if you were forced to do a crime that you wouldn't have otherwise committed. So for instance, if I come up to you and I say, hey, you want to sell some crack, you can make a lot of money, and you do it, that's a legitimate catch. Like, if somebody else would have offered you, you would have jumped on it. Now, if I come up to you and I say, like, hey, I'm holding your wife hostage, I'm going to kill you if you don't sell crack, now we've got entrapment. Absolutely, absolutely. Offering somebody, presenting somebody the opportunity to commit a crime and then them committing it does not rise to the level of entrapment. Absolutely not.
No, you're right about that, but your example of what is entrapment is way overboard.
Well, if you threaten somebody, if you make somebody, I'm not saying it has to go that far.
You have to present circumstances that would make like it's a weird way the law is written, but to make present them circumstances that would make somebody who would not normally commit this crime commit the crime. Like, you're literally entrapping them. But you don't kidnapping their family and taking them hostage. That has nothing to do with
I'm giving the most extreme example.
No,
I'm just
that's
saying that,
literally like a different crime, though.
Sure, okay, but I'm saying that if
it's
you
like
present,
not an
if you
example
present
of
somebody the opportunity to commit a crime and they do the crime, that's not entrapment. That doesn't count as entrapment.
Like, if somebody held a gun to your wife's head and made you do something, don't go to court and be like, I was entrapped, bro.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, and we have far more than 5 people. So, quick question directed at one person, one answer.
Yes, my question's for Stephen over here. So you said earlier that part of the justification for vaccinating children is to protect others. You gave the example of Timmy spreading it to Jimmy, giving it to Grandma, right? Now, are you familiar with the study that came out of Barnstable County, Massachusetts, about 2 or 3 months ago, where they found that the viral load in vaccinated people was very similar to the viral load in unvaccinated people that had, well, I guess the vaccinated people have had breakthrough cases. With that being said, if you're less likely to show symptoms if you're vaccinated, wouldn't the person who would be the most risk to spread disease amongst children and spread to a grandmother be somebody who's actually vaccinated?
So I know there's been a study. I know there's at least
Yes.
one that came out that said that I think at the peak time of symptoms, viral load for vaccinated people, I think was similar to unvaccinated people. I don't remember if that was a preprint or if this is like published, peer-reviewed and everything. But even if that was the case, to figure out who's more likely to transmit, at the end of the day, we still have to gather the data on that and publish the research. Just because there might be a mechanism by which we can guess there might be more transmission, for instance, being asymptomatic, doesn't necessarily mean we can say there was more transmission, because there might be other confounding factors that make it so that's not the case. So for instance, if a vaccinated person has a high viral load but is less likely to get infected in the first place, that might be a confound that would reduce the likelihood of transmission, even if they might do it asymptomatically without being aware of it.
So doesn't that sound like a bunch of stuff we should probably figure out before we push national mandates?
Yes. I guess, Steve, what I would say is,
I mean, this is what the CDC studies. You can go and read the site. You can read the study if you want to look it up.
This is off the CDC's website.
But, like,
highest
also,
vaccinated, highest cases in the highest vaccinated places.
You work
Israel.
for Pfizer now.
Right. Yep.
I mean,
Next question.
I just want to know.
Based on Pfizer pilled.
I just want to know how many of you up here actually believe that the FDA did approve the COVID vaccine, and if they indeed did not approve the COVID vaccine, I'm not talking about the press release that was released. I'm saying, did any of you bother to actually go to FDA and see if it was actually approved? And if not, what can you tell everybody about the Nuremberg Code and how forcing experimental treatments is a violation of the Nuremberg Code and a crime, a war crime against humanity?
Did we walk to the FDA building? Was that the question? Or I didn't, so.
Did you go online and actually look at FDA and see the FDA document and what was actually approved?
Are you referring to the fact that it was approved for a later date?
Or I think the only vaccine that's approved right now, I think it's called the. Yeah. So I believe it was the Pfizer. The only one that's gotten past the EUA, I believe, is the Pfizer. I think it's called Community or something. Like the actual name of the Pfizer one is the one that's been approved, I believe.
And it's only done overseas, not in America.
What's only done overseas?
The one that's being.
But the FDA doesn't approve drugs for overseas. For Europe, it'd be the EMA that approves the drug. The FDA has approved Pfizer's version of the vaccine.
We have to move on to our next question.
Next question, yeah.
The FDA sucks.
I was kind of hoping that was going to have a little bit more time, but this will go out to any righty that wants to take it on stage, all right?
So, I can't hear anything.
Say again?
Speak up. Speak up.
Do you want to try it without the mic?
Yeah, let's try it without. Can you say it without the mic?
Okay. So you said, and this goes to the conservatives, so you said that you're simply hated by your political opponents on the left, and you compared yourselves to a bear who was simply being poked, and that these feelings that the left has for you is not deserved. Forgetting political parties, that self-described conservatives have been seen throughout time to be supporting things like obscenity laws, anti-gay laws that bans them from being able to have legal marriage, Jim Crow laws, white backlash towards anti-segregation, and blasphemy laws and more. Do you really feel like none of these feelings that the left has for the right are deserved at all?
Yeah, but see, you're doing the exact same thing that you just said you were against, right? You're taking things from throughout history that none of us up here that I recall have said that we espouse and just applying it with a broad brush to a group of people that you don't like. You're doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, I'm Northern scum, so I don't know what you're talking about, Jim Crow laws, and I didn't do none of that. Also, Jim Crow laws and a lot of segregation wasn't a response to anti-segregation legislation. Segregation kind of comes before the anti-segregation movement. A lot of segregationist laws actually came due in the northern parts of the country, in the Midwest, due to the great migration of blacks from the South, because a lot of the blacks that were already in the North and in the West were already integrated. We have this like comical view of America and race relations, that it's like this linear path of improvement, but that is not the case. It's actually like fits and starts in this country. And that's like not only true for black people, but it's true for like Jewish acceptance in the country, for Asians, etc.
So guys, we have to wrap it up. I just want you to give a warm round of applause to Stephen, Sara, Sean, and Jack. And thank you guys for being here with us today.